Thousands of times a year, every single year, this mountain explodes. That is not a typo, and it is not an exaggeration. Sakurajima in southern Japan is so relentlessly active that constant eruption is its normal resting state. And this morning, June 7th, 2026, it turned that constant activity all the way up, burying the city of Kagoshima in ash and putting the whole region on high alert. But the truly unsettling part is not how often it erupts, it is what it is sitting on. Because Sakurajima is not really the main event here. It is a small cone perched on the edge of something 30,000 years older and hundreds of times more powerful, a buried catastrophe that the entire city is, right now, living directly on top of. So what is the real giant beneath Kagoshima, and is it waking up? Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you do not miss any of our nightly debriefs, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Now let us get into it. Part 1. The morning the sky turned to ash. The footage coming out of southern Japan right now is the kind of thing that stops you mid-scroll, because at first your brain refuses to file it correctly. You're looking at a city, a real, modern city, with high-rise apartment towers and traffic lights and parked cars and the ordinary machinery of a few 100,000 people getting ready for their day. And rising behind those buildings, swallowing the entire skyline, is a black wall. It climbs and it spreads and it leans over the rooftops like something out of a disaster film. And your first instinct is to reach for a familiar explanation. You think, that has to be a thunderstorm. That has to be a wall of dust rolling in off some desert. That has to be the leading edge of a tornado. Your mind offers you every weather event it knows, because those are the categories you have for a sky doing this. And every one of those guesses is wrong. What you are looking at is not weather at all. It is rock. It is pulverized stone and glass and ash, thrown kilometers into the air by a mountain, and it is now falling back down onto a Japanese city of more than 500,000 people. The mountain is called Sakurajima, and on the morning of June 7th, 2026, it did something that put the entire surrounding region on high alert and reminded the people of one of the most prepared nations on Earth exactly what they live next to. This was a major explosive eruption, and it sent an enormous plume of volcanic ash directly over the city of Kagoshima, blanketing streets, cars, bicycles, rooftops, and lungs in a fine grey fallout that turned a bright morning into something closer to twilight. Authorities issued a formal volcanic ash warning for the city. The alert level, already elevated, held firm, and the most unsettling detail of all is the one that does not show up in any single photograph. The detail you only feel when you understand the geography of this place. The mountain that did this is not somewhere out on a remote frontier. It is sitting roughly 4 kilometers away. That is about 2.5 miles. You could see it from a downtown window. You could reach it, on an ordinary day, by a ferry ride of about 15 minutes. The people of Kagoshima did not watch this eruption on a screen the way the rest of the world did. They walked out into it. I want you to hold on to that distance, because it is the entire reason this story matters, and it is the thread we are going to follow all the way down. There are volcanoes erupting somewhere on this planet almost every single day. Most of them you will never hear about, because they erupt in the ocean, or in the empty corners of Alaska and Kamchatka and the Andes, far from anyone. What makes Sakurajima different is not that it erupted. Sakurajima erupts constantly. What makes it different is who lives beside it, and how close they sit, and the fact that this particular eruption was big enough to bury their city in ash for hours. That is the difference between a footnote in a scientific bulletin and the dark wall of debris standing over a skyline of apartment towers. Because here is what most of the coverage will get right, and then completely fail to follow through on. They will show you the footage. They will tell you that Sakurajima erupted, that ash fell on Kagoshima, that a warning was issued. They will give you the surface of the event, the dramatic image, and the immediate facts, and then they will move on to the next story, leaving you with the impression that you have understood what happened. But you will not have understood it, not really, because the surface of this event is the least interesting and least important part of it. The footage of the ash cloud is the trailer. The actual film is everything underneath, the mountain and its history and the caldera and the tectonic engine, and the city full of people who have built an entire civilization of preparedness around a giant they cannot move and cannot tame. That is the story worth your time, and it is the story almost no one tells, because it requires going beneath the surface, down into the geology and the deep time, and the genuinely difficult questions about how a society lives with a permanent existential neighbour. That is exactly where we are going. So let me take you through exactly what happened, and then I am going to take you somewhere most of the coverage will not go, because the eruption you're watching today is only the surface of something far, far larger. The story of Sakurajima is not really the story of a mountain that throws ash. It is the story of what is underneath it, and what the people of Kagoshima have quietly agreed to live on top of. And once you understand what that is, you will never look at this footage the same way again. The eruption itself began in the early hours of the morning local time. Now here we hit our first interesting wrinkle, and I want to be honest with you about it from the start, because honesty about uncertainty is the whole reason a channel like this is worth your time. There is some genuine disagreement between sources about exactly how long this eruption lasted, and exactly how high the ash went. The official monitoring agencies, the people with the seismometers and the satellite feeds, logged a principal explosive event that ran for roughly an hour, with the ash column rising on the order of 1,300 metres above the crater rim. That is about 4,300 feet of vertical ash, measured from the top of the mountain. But other reporting, including accounts from people watching it unfold in real time, described something that went on far longer, an eruption that began around 5 in the morning and continued fluctuating in intensity for something like 7 hours, with the plume reaching as high as 3,500 metres, even 4,400 metres by some accounts. 3,500 metres is around 11,500 feet of ash standing in the sky. So which is it? An hour or 7 hours? 1,300 metres or 3,500? And the answer, I think, is that both of those things are true at the same time, and understanding why is your first real lesson in how these mountains actually behave. A volcano like Sakurajima does not erupt the way a bomb goes off, one single clean blast and then silence. It pulses, it surges and it eases and it surges again. So you can have a single, discrete, violently explosive event that an agency logs precisely. The one big blast that the instruments catch and timestamp to the minute, sitting inside a much longer window of continuous fluctuating ash emission that someone on the ground experiences as one long, grinding 7-hour ordeal. The instrument captures the spike. The human captures the whole exhausting morning. Neither one is lying. They are measuring two different things. And that gap between the clean number and the lived experience is something we are going to come back to, because it sits at the heart of why these volcanoes are so hard to live beside. I want to dwell for a moment on what volcanic ash actually is, because the word ash is one of the most misleading words in the entire language of disaster, and the misunderstanding it creates is precisely why people underestimate an event like this. When you hear the word ash, your mind reaches for the soft, light, harmless grey powder left behind by a campfire or a fireplace, something you could brush off your sleeve without a second thought. Volcanic ash is nothing like that. Volcanic ash is rock. It is finely fragmented stone and volcanic glass, jagged microscopic shards created when molten rock is blasted apart and quenched in the air. Under a microscope, a single particle of volcanic ash looks like a splinter of broken glass, because that is essentially what it is. It is abrasive enough to scratch glass and metal. It is heavy, far heavier than wood ash, so that when it accumulates on a roof in sufficient depth, especially if rain wets it and adds weight, it can threaten to collapse the structure beneath it. It does not dissolve. It does not blow away easily. It coats everything in a gritty, clinging layer that has to be physically removed. And when that material falls on a living city, the consequences ripple outward in every direction at once. It chokes the air, and breathing it is genuinely hazardous, which is why the warnings that accompany these events urge people to stay indoors and to wear masks if they must go out, because those glass shards in the lungs are no small matter, particularly for children, for the elderly, and for anyone with respiratory conditions. It blankets the roads, reducing traction and visibility, snarling traffic and making driving dangerous. It infiltrates machinery, working its abrasive way into engines and ventilation systems and electronics, which is why ashfall so reliably grounds aircraft. An airplane flying through a volcanic ash cloud can have its engines fail outright, because the ash melts inside the hot engine and resolidifies on critical surfaces, which is the entire reason a dense network of volcanic ash advisory centres exists worldwide, tracking these plumes specifically to keep aircraft out of them. It disrupts rail service, it contaminates water supplies, it buries crops. It is, in short, a slow, smothering, multi-system assault on the normal functioning of a city and the city of Kagoshima absorbed exactly that on the morning of June 7th, with the fallout drifting south and the advisories tracking it for tens of kilometers across the prefecture and beyond. What everyone agrees on is the thing that matters most. This was large. This was significant. This was an eruption big enough that the government of Japan, a nation that does not panic easily and does not issue warnings for nothing, told the people of an entire city to take the falling ash seriously. And as the morning went on, the headlines kept coming, each one a little heavier than the last, the live ticker updating in real time as the mountain kept going. A major explosive eruption, a massive plume over the prefecture, an official ash warning for the city, and underneath all of it, the quiet, constant 4-kilometer fact. This is happening right next door to where people live. So what exactly is this mountain? Why does it sit where it sits? And what is the thing beneath it that should genuinely give us pause? That is where we're going next, and I promise you, the closer you look at Sakurajima, the stranger and more remarkable it becomes. Part 2. The Mountain That Never Sleeps. To understand what happened on June 7th, you first have to understand that Sakurajima is not a normal volcano having an unusual day. Sakurajima is an extraordinarily abnormal volcano having a fairly typical one, and that distinction is the key to everything. Let me give you the shape of it. Sakurajima sits in Kagoshima Bay, on the island of Kyushu, which is the southwesternmost of Japan's 4 main islands. Its summit stands a little over 1,100 meters high, around 3,665 feet, which by the standards of the world's great volcanoes is not especially tall. But height is not what makes this mountain remarkable. What makes it remarkable is its relentlessness. Sakurajima is one of the most continuously active volcanoes anywhere on the planet. We are not talking about a mountain that erupts once a decade or once a generation, the way most people imagine volcanoes behaving. We are talking about a mountain that produces minor explosive eruptions in the thousands every single year. Thousands! Smoke and ash venting from its summit is not the exception for this place. It is the baseline. It is the resting state. On a quiet day, Sakurajima is still smoking, and the activity is not random or featureless, which is part of what makes Sakurajima so valuable to science, even as it endangers the people nearby. Because it erupts so frequently and is so intensely monitored, Sakurajima has become one of the most important natural laboratories on Earth for understanding how volcanoes work. Researchers from Japan and around the world study it precisely because it offers something rare, a volcano that erupts often enough to provide a constant stream of data sitting within reach of world-class scientific institutions, with a long and detailed historical record of its behavior. Much of what we understand about the precursors to volcanic explosions, about how the ground deforms before a blast, about how to interpret the seismic and acoustic signatures of an eruption, has been refined and tested at Sakurajima. In a grim irony, the same relentless activity that forces the children to wear helmets has made this mountain a teacher, a place where the science of predicting and understanding volcanic behavior has been advanced for the benefit of vulnerable communities everywhere. The people of Kagoshima do not merely endure their volcano, they have, in a sense, turned it into one of the most instructive volcanoes on the planet, and the knowledge gained here ripples outward to improve the monitoring of dangerous volcanoes in many other countries that lack Japan's resources and expertise. The summit itself is not a single neat cone. It is a ridge of 3 main peaks lined up roughly north to south. The northern peak is called Kitadaki, and it is the old one, the inactive one, the part of the mountain that has gone quiet. The central peak is Nakadeki, and the southern peak, the one doing nearly all of the work, the one responsible for the wall of ash that stood over Kagoshima on June 7th, is called Minamidake. Minamidake is the engine. It is in a state of near-constant eruptive activity, and alongside it, on its eastern flank, sits another frequent vent called the Showa crater, which has done a great deal of the erupting over the past couple of decades. When you see Sakurajima throwing ash, you're almost always watching Minamidake, or its Showa crater neighbour, doing what it does essentially all the time, just turned up loud. Now, here is a detail that tells you everything about what it means to live near this mountain, and it is the kind of detail that sounds made up the first time you hear it. The school children of Kagoshima go to school wearing hard hats, helmets, not for cycling, not for sport, but as a routine precaution against the sky. Because when Minamidake has one of its more emphatic moments, it does not just produce a soft drift of ash, it throws rock. It hurls solid volcanic material, chunks of stone, out of the crater at tremendous speed, And those fragments, the ones scientists sometimes call volcanic bombs or ballistic ejecta, can come down hard enough and fast enough to seriously injure a person. So the children wear helmets, and it does not stop with helmets. Scattered throughout the inhabited areas around the mountain are reinforced concrete shelters, squat little bunkers that exist for one purpose, so that if the mountain suddenly explodes while you're out in the open, you have somewhere to dive for cover before the falling rock arrives. Think about what that means. An entire community has restructured its physical environment, its schools, its streets, its daily habits, around the assumption that the mountain may, at any moment, start shooting stone into the air. That is not fear. That is something much more interesting than fear. We will come back to it. It is worth pausing on just how unusual this near-constant activity is, even among the world's volcanoes, because most people carry a mental model of volcanoes that is almost entirely wrong. The popular image of a volcano is a mountain that sits quietly for centuries, a postcard of a peaceful snow-capped peak, and then one day erupts in a single catastrophic event before going back to sleep. And some volcanoes do behave roughly like that. But Sakurajima belongs to a much rarer category, the persistently active volcano, the kind that does not sleep at all, that maintains an open, restless connection to the magma below, and vents that pressure more or less continuously in a long series of explosions stretching across years and decades. Volcanoes like this are a small and special club. Stromboli, off the coast of Italy, has been erupting so regularly for so long that it earned the nickname the Lighthouse of the Mediterranean, its glow visible to sailors across centuries. A handful of others around the world maintain this kind of open vent persistence. Sakurajima is one of the most vigorous members of that club, and it has been in this heightened state of activity for an extended period, with the active vent shifting over the years between the summit Minamidake crater and the Showa crater on its flank. To live near a volcano like this is to live near a mountain that is not a sleeping threat that might wake, but a perpetually awake presence that is simply louder on some days than others. June 7th was a loud day, but there is, in a sense, no truly quiet day at Sakurajima, no day when the mountain is fully at rest. The mountain is also absurdly easy to reach, which only deepens the strangeness. From Kagoshima City, you can get to Sakurajima by a ferry ride of roughly 15 minutes. 15 minutes. People commute longer than that to work in most cities on Earth, and on the island itself, in the literal shadow of one of the most active volcanoes in the world, approximately 4,600 people live their lives. They farm, they run shops, they raise families, they coexist, day in and day out, with regular ashfall, with the constant low possibility of a sudden explosion, with a neighbour that has never, in living memory, fully gone to sleep. And they manage it, not through denial, but through one of the most organised, clear-eyed disaster preparedness cultures anywhere on the planet. There is a question that naturally arises here, which is why the southern peak, Minamidake, does all the work while the northern peak sits silent, and the answer opens a window into how these mountains evolve over time. A volcano is not a permanent fixed plumbing system. The pathways that magma takes to reach the surface shift over the centuries and millennia as old conduits become blocked with cooled rock and new ones open under the relentless pressure from below. Kitadeke, the northern peak, was once the active centre of Sakurajima, the place where the mountain did its erupting in an earlier era. But over time the locus of activity migrated southward, and today it is Minamidake and the Showa crater on its flank that sit above the open pathway to the magma below. This migration is itself a reminder that the mountain is a living, evolving thing, not a static feature, and that the configuration we see today is just a snapshot of an ongoing process. Centuries from now, the active vent may have shifted again. The mountain is rebuilding and rerouting itself continuously, and the people who live beside it are watching a single frame of a film that has been running for tens of thousands of years and will run for tens of thousands more. The smoke rising from Minamidake on June 7th is rising from the currently open door in a structure whose doors are perpetually closing and opening, as the deep pressure seeks its path to the sky. This is where the central thread of our story begins to come into focus, so let me say it plainly. The eruption of June 7th is dramatic. But the eruption is not by itself the remarkable thing here. The remarkable thing is the relationship. It is the fact that a modern, wealthy, technologically advanced city of hundreds of thousands of people has chosen, knowingly and permanently, to live 4 kilometers from a mountain that erupts thousands of times a year and has built an entire way of life around making that survivable. That relationship is the real subject of this video. Everything else, the ash, the alert level, the headlines, is just the surface expression of it. And to understand how that relationship came to be, and why it is so much more precarious than even the helmets and shelters suggest, we have to go back in time. Because Sakurajima has done something to this region before, something that physically reshaped the map, and the story of that event tells you exactly what this mountain is capable of when it stops merely smoking and decides to truly erupt. Part 3. The eruption that joined an island to the land. The name Sakurajima means, more or less, Cherry Blossom Island, and that name carries a fossil inside it, a clue to something that is no longer quite true. Because Sakurajima, despite the name, is not an island anymore. It used to be. For most of its existence it stood as a separate volcanic island, surrounded on all sides by the waters of Kagoshima Bay. And then, a little over a century ago, the mountain rewrote its own geography in a matter of weeks. The year was 1914, and the eruption that began that January is remembered as the Taisho eruption, named for the imperial era in which it occurred, and it stands as the most powerful Japanese volcanic eruption of the entire 20th century. This was not a Minamidek smoking session. This was the real thing, the kind of event that the thousands of small annual eruptions are in a sense only hinting at. The mountain tore open and poured out an enormous volume of lava, and as that lava flowed down the eastern flank of the volcano and into the narrow strait that separated the island from the Osumi Peninsula on the mainland, it did something permanent. It filled the channel. It bridged the gap. The molten rock cooled and hardened into new land, and when it was over, the island that had been Cherry Blossom Island was no longer an island at all. It had been welded to the mainland by a tongue of fresh volcanic rock. To this day, you can drive across that land bridge. It exists because a mountain decided in 1914 to connect itself to Japan. There is more to the 1914 story, and the details matter because they reveal both the danger of the mountain and the origins of the preparedness that defines the region today. In the days before the Great Eruption began, the people living on the island noticed warning signs. The ground shook with increasing frequency. The water in wells behaved strangely. There were felt earthquakes growing in number and intensity, the seismic drumroll of magma forcing its way upward through the crust. And crucially, in a decision that would become a painful and instructive part of local memory, there was confusion and delay in the official response, a reluctance in some quarters to order evacuation, a message in some accounts that the mountain was safe even as the residents' own senses told them otherwise. Many people, trusting their instincts over the reassurances, began to evacuate on their own initiative before the worst arrived, and that self-directed flight saved lives. When the eruption finally unleashed its full fury, it poured out lava and hurled ash, and triggered the earthquakes that accompanied it, and dozens died. But the toll would have been far higher had the population not largely gotten themselves clear. That episode burned a lesson into the collective consciousness of the region, a lesson about the gap between official reassurance and the evidence of the ground itself, and about the value of preparation and the willingness to act on warning signs. It is no coincidence, I think, that the area around Sakurajima went on to develop one of the most rigorous and proactive disaster preparedness cultures anywhere on Earth. The helmets, the shelters, the relentless monitoring, the readiness to evacuate, all of it grows in part from the memory of 1914, from a community that learned the hard way what this mountain can do and resolved never to be caught unready again. There is even a stone monument on the island, erected after the disaster, that carries an inscription urging residents to be wary of official reassurances and to trust the warning signs of the mountain. A remarkable piece of folk wisdom carved in stone, a message from the survivors of one eruption to the potential victims of the next. The people of Kagoshima carry that message forward, and it shapes how they respond to every plume, including the one that rose on June 7th. Sit with the scale of that for a moment, because it is genuinely difficult to absorb. We casually say that volcanoes reshape the landscape, but we rarely mean it as literally as this. The eruption did not merely cover some terrain in ash or knock down some trees, it changed the coastline. It erased a strait that had existed throughout human memory and replaced it with solid ground. The maps of the region had to be redrawn. Geography, which we tend to think of as the one fixed and reliable thing under our feet, turned out to be something the mountain could edit at will, and it cost lives. Dozens of people died in the 1914 eruption, and the event left a deep mark on the collective memory of the region, a mark that, I would argue, is part of why the preparedness culture there is as rigorous as it is. The people of Kagoshima are not careful because of an abstraction. They are careful because the mountain has shown them, within the span of recorded history, exactly what it can do. So when you look at the ash falling on June 7th, I want you to layer this knowledge underneath it. The eruption you are watching is small. I mean that precisely, and I will keep saying it, because it is important. In the grand vocabulary of what this mountain has done and can do, an eruption that throws ash a few thousand meters into the air and dusts a city is a minor event. It is the mountain clearing its throat. The 1914 eruption, the one that built the land bridge, was on a completely different order of magnitude, and even that, as we are about to discover, was itself dwarfed by something far older and far more terrible that happened in this exact spot. The thread I want you to keep hold of is this. Everything we are seeing today is a small expression of a system that has demonstrated repeatedly the capacity for something enormous. The helmets, the shelters, the 4-kilometer city, all of it exists in the gap between what the mountain does on a typical Tuesday and what the mountain has proven it can do when it fully wakes. It is worth lingering on what the land bridge means as a physical fact you can stand on today, because it transforms an abstract historical event into something tangible and present. The lava that connected Sakurajima to the Osumi Peninsula in 1914 did not vanish. It is still there, a permanent feature of the landscape, the solidified remains of a river of molten rock that flowed within living memory of people whose grandparents are still alive. You can walk across ground that did not exist before the mountain made it. You can stand on rock that was liquid stone pouring from a volcano in the early 20th century. There is something profoundly humbling about that. The way it collapses the comfortable distance we like to keep between ourselves and geological time. We tend to think of the great earth-shaping events as belonging to a deep past, to a world before us, written in rock laid down over eons. But the Sakurajima land bridge is geology you could have witnessed, geology that happened in photographs, geology with survivors. It is a reminder that the planet is not finished, that the maps are not final, that the ground beneath even a modern city is a living, changing thing that can be rewritten by the forces below, and it raises the stakes of every subsequent eruption, because the people of Kagoshima know, not as theory but as local history, that their mountain has the power to remake the very land they stand on. And that brings us to the question that the scientists who watch this place never stop asking. The question that turns Sakurajima from an interesting regional hazard into something that deserves the attention of the entire world. Sakurajima is not a freestanding mountain that happens to erupt a lot. Sakurajima is a small cone sitting on the edge of something vastly larger. It is perched on the rim of a wound in the earth, a wound left by a catastrophe so immense that the bay the city sits beside is, in a very real sense, the scar. To understand the true stakes of what is happening here, we have to stop looking at the mountain and start looking at the hole it is standing on. We have to talk about the Aira caldera. Part 4. The Scar Beneath the Bay. Here is a fact about Kagoshima that almost no one looking at the eruption footage realizes, and once you know it, the entire landscape rearranges itself in your mind. The bay itself, that wide, calm body of water that the city sits beside, and that the ferries cross in 15 minutes, is not an ordinary bay. The northern part of Kagoshima Bay is a caldera. It is the flooded crater of an ancient volcanic catastrophe so large that it collapsed the ground over a vast area and left a depression that the sea has since filled in. It is called the Aira caldera. And Sakurajima, the mountain that buried the city in ash on June 7th, is not the main event here. Sakurajima is just the most active cone that has grown up on the southern rim of that ancient scar. The volcano the city fears is, geologically speaking, a small child standing on the edge of its parents' grave. The eruption that formed the Aira caldera happened roughly 30,000 years ago, and it was one of the largest eruptions in all of Japan's prehistory, an event of a category we now call, with appropriate dread, a caldera-forming eruption. When a volcanic system erupts on that scale, it does not simply throw out a plume and a lava flow. It empties an enormous magma chamber so rapidly and so completely that the ground above the chamber, having lost its support, collapses downward into the void, dropping the surface over a region many kilometers across and creating the huge circular depression we call a caldera. The Aira event ejected staggering volumes of material. It produced what geologists call the Ito pyroclastic flow, a ground-hugging avalanche of superheated gas and ashen rock that would have raced across the surrounding landscape at lethal speed, incinerating everything in its path, and it laid down a thick blanket of pumice, the Osumi pumice, across the region. The numbers involved are the kind that stop meaning anything to a human brain. We are talking about an eruption hundreds of times larger than the 1914 event that built the land bridge, and the 1914 event was already the most powerful Japanese eruption of the 20th century. Stack those comparisons on top of each other, and you begin to feel the vertigo of it. The eruption that dusts the city today is a whisper. The eruption that built the land bridge was a shout. The eruption that formed the caldera was a scream that reshaped the entire region and left a hole the sea is still filling. To understand why a caldera-forming eruption is in a category entirely apart from anything else a volcano does, you have to understand the mechanics of the collapse itself, because that is the part that makes these events so uniquely terrifying. In an ordinary eruption, even a large one like 1914, the volcano vents magma and gas through its conduit, and the mountain largely remains standing afterward, changed but intact. A caldera-forming eruption is different in kind, not just degree. It begins when an enormous reservoir of magma accumulated over millennia in a chamber that can span tens of kilometers finds its way to the surface and begins to erupt with such violence and at such a rate that it empties faster than anything below can replace it. As that vast volume of molten rock and gas evacuates the chamber, it leaves behind a void, a gigantic underground cavity where the magma used to be, and the rock above that cavity, the entire overlying landscape, mountains and valleys and everything on them, suddenly has nothing holding it up. So it falls. The roof of the chamber collapses downward into the emptied space, dropping the surface by hundreds of meters across a region kilometers wide, in one of the most violent geological events the planet can produce. The collapse itself drives even more material out in a final convulsion, and what remains afterward is the caldera, the great circular pit left where a landscape used to be. The northern reaches of Kagoshima Bay are precisely that, a drowned collapse pit, the negative space left behind when an unimaginable volume of magma exited the Earth 30,000 years ago, and the ground fell in behind it. And the material that comes out in such an event does not behave like ordinary lava, which flows slowly enough that you can often walk away from it. The signature killer of a caldera eruption is the pyroclastic flow, and the Aira event produced one of the defining examples, the Ito pyroclastic flow. A pyroclastic flow is a ground-hugging avalanche of superheated gas, ash and rock fragments, often hundreds of degrees hot, that races outward from the erupting vent at speeds that can exceed those of a moving vehicle, flowing across the landscape like a scalding, suffocating flood that destroys everything in its path and is utterly impossible to outrun. The Ito pyroclastic flow swept across the region around Kagoshima Bay, and the deposits it left behind, along with the thick blanket of Osumi pumice that fell from the sky, are written into the very geology of the area, layers of rock that record the magnitude of what happened. When geologists study those layers, they are reading the receipt of a catastrophe, and the receipt tells them that the Aira system, the system on whose rim Sakurajima now sits and erupts, is capable of devastation on a scale that would not merely threaten Kagoshima, but would alter the climate and the landscape across a vast surrounding region. Now, the crucial question, the one I know you are already asking, is the obvious one. If that happened once, can it happen again? And here I have to be extremely careful, because this is exactly the kind of place where honest science and irresponsible fear-mongering go their separate ways, and I want to keep us firmly on the honest side. So let me give you the real answer, with all its nuance intact. The Aira caldera is not extinct. The magma system beneath it is still there, and it is, by every measurement we have, slowly recharging. Scientists have been watching the floor of the caldera for a long time, using extraordinarily precise instruments that can detect the ground rising or falling by mere centimeters, and what they have documented over the decades is a gradual inflation, a slow swelling of the caldera floor that is consistent with magma accumulating at depth. The system is, in the most literal sense, refilling. The reservoir that emptied 30,000 years ago is, drop by drop over the centuries, taking on new magma. That is a real, measured, scientifically documented fact, and it is the reason the Aira system is considered one of the most important long-term volcanic hazards in all of Japan. It is worth understanding what that recharging actually involves at the level of the rock, because the picture most people have of a magma chamber is misleading, and the reality is both stranger and more reassuring. When we say the Aira system is recharging, the image that comes to mind is usually a great underground cavern slowly filling with liquid rock, like a tank filling with water, building toward the moment it overflows. But that is not how most magma systems work. The reservoir beneath a caldera is generally not a vast open pool of molten rock. It is more like a hot, partially molten zone, a region of crystal-rich mush, where pockets of liquid magma are interspersed through a framework of solid and semi-solid crystals, the whole thing more like a slushy or a water-soaked sponge than an open lake. For that system to produce a caldera-forming eruption, a great deal has to happen. Enough of the mush has to become mobile, enough liquid has to accumulate and connect, enough pressure has to build, the overlying rock has to be primed to fail in the right way. This is a complex, multi-stage process, and it generally unfolds over very long spans of time, with many checkpoints along the way, each of which would be expected to produce detectable signals. The slow inflation we measure is one early and ambiguous part of that long story, not the final step before the trigger. So when we say the system is recharging, we are describing the gradual early-stage accumulation of magma into a mush that is, by every indication, very far from the state required for a catastrophic eruption. The recharging is real. The distance still to travel before catastrophe is vast, and the path between here and there is one that we would expect to watch unfold across a long sequence of escalating warnings, not one that ends in a sudden bolt from a clear sky. But, and this is the part that the doomsday versions of this story always leave out, recharging is not the same as erupting, and a slow swelling measured in centimetres over decades is not a countdown clock. There is no scientific indication, none, that another caldera-forming super-eruption is imminent. An event on that scale would be expected to announce itself with enormous and unmistakable precursors, with dramatic changes in seismic activity, ground deformation, and gas emissions, the kind of signals that the dense monitoring network around this volcano is specifically designed to catch, and it would do so well in advance. The honest framing, the one the actual experts hold, is a framing of scale and timescale. Today's eruptions are the normal minor venting of a system that is, on geological timescales, capable of much larger behaviour, but is not on any human-relevant near-term schedule to do so. The thread that runs through all of this, the thing I keep wanting you to feel, is the tension between those two truths held at once. The system is loaded. The system is recharging. The system has done something civilization-ending before. And also, the system is not about to do it tomorrow, and the smartest people watching it are not lying awake in terror. They are watching the instruments and doing their jobs. Both of those things are true. Living with Sakurajima means living inside that exact contradiction, and the people of Kagoshima do it every single day. Part 5. Why the volcano is there at all. To really understand Sakurajima, we have to zoom out one more level, past the mountain, past the caldera, all the way to the machinery of the planet itself. Because the question that sits underneath everything we have discussed so far is a deceptively simple one. Why is there a volcano here in the first place? Why does Japan, of all the places on Earth, get so much of this? The constant eruptions, the great earthquakes, the tsunamis. Why is this one chain of islands seemingly singled out to absorb the worst the Earth has to offer? And the answer reveals that the eruption we're watching is not an isolated event at all. It is one surface symptom of a single, vast, grinding process that runs beneath the entire country. Japan sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire. You've probably heard that phrase, and it gets used so often that it has almost lost its meaning, so let me make it real again. The Ring of Fire is a roughly horseshoe-shaped belt that traces the rim of the Pacific Ocean, running up the western coasts of South and North America, across to Alaska, and down through Kamchatka, and Japan, and the Philippines, and Indonesia, and out to New Zealand. And along almost that entire belt, the same fundamental thing is happening. The great rigid plates that make up the surface of the Earth are colliding, and where an oceanic plate meets a continental one, the denser oceanic plate is being forced downward, dragged beneath the other, and back into the hot interior of the planet. That process is called subduction, and it is, without exaggeration, the most important geological process for understanding why Japan is the way it is. Japan sits at a brutal convergence point, a place where several of these plates come together. The Pacific Plate and the Philippine Sea Plate are both diving down beneath the plates that the Japanese islands ride on. And down in Kyushu, where Sakurajima stands, it is the subduction of the Philippine Sea Plate, plunging down along the trench systems to the south and east, that drives the local geology. Now, here is the elegant and terrible thing about subduction, the thing that ties the whole story together. When that oceanic plate descends into the depths, it does not go quietly, and it does not go dry. It carries water down with it, locked into the minerals of the seafloor. And as it sinks deeper and gets hotter, and the pressure climbs, that water is gradually cooked out of the rock. The released water rises into the wedge of hot mantle material above the descending plate, and it does something remarkable. It lowers the melting point of that mantle rock, causing it to partially melt and generate magma. That magma, being less dense than the rock around it, begins to rise, and where it reaches the surface you get a volcano. You get an arc of volcanoes, in fact, a chain of them running parallel to the trench, fed by the same subduction engine all along its length. Sakurajima is one bead on that string. The volcanic arc of Japan exists because the Philippine Sea Plate and the Pacific Plate are diving into the earth and sweating their water into the mantle as they go. There is a beautiful and slightly counterintuitive detail buried in this process that I cannot resist sharing, because it overturns the simple picture most people carry of how volcanoes form. You might assume that the magma feeding a volcano is just melted rock from the descending plate itself, the subducting slab liquefying as it heats up and that liquid rising to the surface. But that is not really what happens, and the truth is stranger and more elegant. The descending plate, for the most part, does not melt. It stays solid as it plunges into the depths. What melts is the rock of the mantle wedge above it, and the trigger for that melting is not heat alone but water. The water cooked out of the descending slab rises into the overlying mantle, and the addition of water dramatically lowers the temperature at which that mantle rock will melt, a process called flux melting. It is the same principle as throwing salt on an icy road. You do not warm the ice, you change its chemistry so that it melts at a temperature it otherwise would not. The water flux does that to the mantle, coaxing it to melt at temperatures it could otherwise withstand, and the magma that results is the lifeblood of every volcano in the arc. So when you watch Sakurajima erupt, you are, in a very real sense, watching water from an ancient seafloor, dragged down into the earth and sweated back out, returning to the surface in the form of molten rock and ash. The ocean feeds the volcano. That is the hidden poetry of subduction. But subduction does not only make volcanoes, and this is where the full weight of Japan's situation comes crashing into view. The same descending plate that feeds the volcanoes also gets stuck. As it grinds downward beneath the overriding plate, the two surfaces lock against each other, and stress builds, and builds, and builds, sometimes for centuries, until the lock finally fails and the accumulated strain releases all at once in a megathrust earthquake, one of the most violent and destructive events the planet can produce. And if that rupture happens beneath the sea and shoves a huge volume of water upward, it generates a tsunami. Japan knows the cost of that second phase of subduction better than almost any nation on Earth, because it has paid it, repeatedly, within living memory. The Great Earthquake of 2011, the one that struck off the coast of the Tohoku region, was a megathrust event of exactly this kind. The sudden, violent release of centuries of accumulated strain as the descending Pacific Plate finally slipped beneath the plate Japan rides on. It generated a tsunami that overwhelmed coastal defences, killed many thousands of people, and triggered the meltdown at a nuclear power plant, a cascading catastrophe that the nation is still reckoning with years later. And here is the detail that connects it back to our story in a way that should give anyone pause. When scientists later studied the fault that produced that disaster, they found something they had not fully expected. The rupture was, in certain respects, larger and more violent than the prevailing models had anticipated for that particular stretch of the subduction zone. The fault did something that the assumptions had not fully accounted for, and the unsettling implication of that finding is not confined to Japan, because if one segment of a subduction zone can surprise us, can rupture more severely than the models predicted, then the same possibility hangs over every other subduction zone on the planet, including the ones that threaten heavily populated coastlines elsewhere in the world. The lesson of 2011 was a lesson in humility, a reminder that these systems hold the capacity to exceed our expectations, and it is the same lesson, in a different key, that the Aira Caldera teaches, The Earth is capable of more than our models always capture, and the honest response is not panic but vigilance, better monitoring, better preparation, and a healthy respect for how much remains uncertain. So the very same process, the subduction of an oceanic plate beneath Japan, is simultaneously responsible for the volcanoes that erupt like Sakurajima, for the colossal earthquakes that periodically devastate the country, and for the tsunamis that follow them. The volcanoes and the earthquakes are not separate misfortunes that Japan happens to suffer all at once by bad luck. They are two faces of one single underlying machine. When you understand that, the ash over Kagoshima stops looking like an isolated disaster and starts looking like what it really is, a single visible exhalation from a planet-scale engine that is always, always running beneath these islands. This is the deeper reason the preparedness culture exists, and why I keep circling back to it. The people of Japan are not just braced for one kind of disaster, they are braced for an entire interlocking family of them, all driven by the same source, all capable of arriving with little warning. And nowhere is that bracing more visible, more woven into the texture of ordinary life than in the city of Kagoshima living its days 4 kilometers from Minamidake. So let me bring us back from the depths of the mantle to the streets of that city, because the way these people live alongside their mountain is, to me, the most genuinely moving part of this entire story, and it carries a lesson that reaches far beyond Japan. Part 6. A city that learned to live with a monster. Before I answer that question, I want to acknowledge how natural it is to ask it, and then show you why it dissolves the moment you take the lives of the people involved seriously. The impulse to say just leave comes from a place of imagined simplicity. The idea that a community is a thing that can be picked up and moved, that people are interchangeable with their locations, that the rational response to danger is always flight. But human communities are not like that. Kagoshima is not a temporary encampment that happened to set up next to a volcano. It is a city with centuries of history, a place where families have lived for generations, where livelihoods are rooted, where culture and identity and memory are bound up with a specific land and water, and even the mountain itself. The people there are not stubbornly ignoring an obvious solution. They are doing what humans have always done, which is to make a home in the place that is theirs, and to defend that home against the dangers it carries. And it is worth remembering that there is almost nowhere on Earth that is truly free of natural hazard. Leave the volcano and you may find yourself on a fault, or a floodplain, or a hurricane coast, or a place that will be reshaped by a changing climate. The fantasy of the perfectly safe location is just that, a fantasy. Every human community everywhere lives with some version of geological or climatic risk, and the people of Kagoshima have simply made the very human choice to stay rooted in their home and to manage their particular risk as well as it can possibly be managed, rather than to flee towards some imagined safety that does not really exist anywhere. There is a temptation, when we look at people living in the shadow of an obvious danger, to reach for a kind of detached judgment. Why would anyone live there? Why not just leave? It is an easy thing to think from a safe distance. But the longer you look at Kagoshima and Sakurajima, the more that question reveals itself to be the wrong one, and the more the actual answer reshapes how you think about the relationship between humans and the violent planet we live on. Let me paint you the texture of ordinary life in this place, because it is genuinely extraordinary in how ordinary it is. On a typical day, ash from Sakurajima drifts across the region depending on the wind, and the residents have simply built it into their routines the way someone in a snowy climate builds in shoveling. There are special bags for collecting volcanic ash, distributed and managed by the local authorities. There are street cleaning systems geared towards sweeping the grey fallout off the roads. Car owners deal with ash on their windshields the way others deal with pollen or frost. Laundry timing gets planned around which way the ash is blowing. The local weather reports include the ashfall forecast, telling people which neighbourhoods are likely to get dusted today, the way a forecast elsewhere might mention a chance of rain. This is not a community in a constant state of emergency. This is a community that has metabolized a permanent hazard into the rhythm of daily life, so thoroughly that it has become mundane. Consider the schools alone, because the way the education system has adapted tells you everything about how deeply the volcano is woven into the fabric of ordinary life. Children in the area grow up with volcano drills the way children elsewhere grow up with fire drills, learning from a young age what to do when the mountain explodes, where to go, how to protect themselves. The hard hats are issued and worn as a matter of routine, kept at the ready, part of the standard equipment of childhood in this place, Schools have their own ash management procedures, their own shelters, their own protocols for what happens when an eruption coincides with a school day. Imagine being a child in Kagoshima, learning your multiplication tables in a classroom from which, on a clear day, you can see the smoking summit of an active volcano across the bay, knowing that the helmet by your desk is not a toy, but a genuine piece of safety equipment that you might one day actually need. That is the normal childhood of this place. The volcano is not an abstraction or a distant threat in a textbook. It is a daily companion, as familiar as the weather, and the children learn to read its moods the way children elsewhere learn to read an approaching storm. The local government, too, has built its entire structure of public services around the permanent reality of the mountain. There are designated evacuation routes and procedures, refined over decades. There are systems for rapidly disseminating warnings, sirens and broadcasts and alerts that can reach the population in minutes. There are agreements and plans for evacuating the residents of the island itself, should the activity escalate beyond the routine, because everyone understands that the 4,600 people living on Sakurajima may, someday, need to leave quickly. The ferry that brings tourists across in 15 minutes is also, in a sense, a lifeline, a means of moving people off the island in an emergency. All of this represents an enormous, sustained, collective investment of resources and attention and planning. The price a society pays to live where this one lives, and the people of Kagoshima pay it without drama, year after year, as simply the cost of being where they are. And then, layered on top of that mundane adaptation, is the serious infrastructure for the moments when the mountain is not merely smoking but genuinely dangerous. The concrete shelters I mentioned earlier are not decorative. They are positioned so that someone caught outside during a sudden explosion has a place to reach. The helmets the school children wear are not a gimmick for tourists. They are a rational response to the documented fact that this mountain throws rock. The monitoring is relentless, because Sakurajima is one of the most closely watched volcanoes in the entire world, observed continuously by Japanese volcanological authorities precisely because so many people live so close to it. There are seismometers listening for the tremors that precede an eruption. There are tilt meters and satellite-based instruments measuring the subtle swelling of the ground as magma moves beneath it. There are infrasound sensors that can hear the low rumble of an explosion, cameras trained on the summit around the clock, and a whole apparatus of analysts whose job is to take all of that data and translate it, in real time, into warnings and alert levels that ordinary people can act on. When the June 7th eruption began, this entire system was already watching, already measuring, already issuing the ash warning that told the city to take cover. This is what I find genuinely remarkable, and it is the heart of the thread we have been following. The people of Kagoshima have not defeated their volcano, and they have not deluded themselves about it either. They have done something harder and wiser than either of those. They have achieved a kind of clear-eyed coexistence. They know exactly what Minamidak is. They know what 1914 did. They know, at least the experts among them, what the Aira Caldera is capable of on the long horizon. And rather than being paralyzed by that knowledge or fleeing from it, they have built a society that holds the danger in full view and goes on living anyway, with helmets and shelters and ash bags and ferry schedules and forecasts. That is not recklessness. That is not denial. It is, I would argue, one of the more impressive things a human community can do. It is the art of living knowingly on top of a loaded planet. And it raises a question that I think reaches well beyond this one Japanese city, a question that is really the philosophical core of this whole story. How does anyone rationally and calmly inhabit the rim of a sleeping giant? How do you build a life, raise children, run a business, plan for the future, 4 kilometers from a mountain that erupts thousands of times a year and sits on a caldera that once helped erase the surrounding region? The people of Kagoshima have an answer, and their answer is not in words. It is in their behavior. The answer is preparation without panic. The answer is respect without paralysis. The answer is to look the danger dead in the eye, understand it as precisely as the science allows, build everything you can to mitigate it, and then go live your life fully in its presence. But before we mistake that for a tidy resolution, I have to complicate it, because there is a reason the scientists never fully relax, and it has to do with the difference between the volcano the city can see and the system the city cannot. Part 7. The Eruption. You see versus the system. You don't. Everything I have told you so far about the June 7th eruption has been, in a sense, about the visible mountain, the thing you can photograph, the ash you can sweep off a car. But the reason this story carries genuine weight, the reason it is worth more than just a striking video, lies in the gap between what is visible and what is not. And that gap is exactly where both the real science and the real fear live. Here is the uncomfortable truth at the center of volcanology, and Sakurajima embodies it perfectly. The behavior we can see is not a reliable guide to the system we cannot. The frequent small eruptions, the daily smoking, the occasional larger blast like June 7th, all of that is the surface venting of a magma system whose deeper state, whose total volume, whose long-term trajectory we can only infer indirectly. We are watching the exhaust and trying to deduce the engine. And the disquieting thing is that the relationship between the two is not simple. A volcano can produce thousands of small eruptions for years and then do something much larger. Or it can rumble alarmingly and then settle back down to nothing. The visible activity is real data, but it is not a transparent window into the future. It is more like watching the steam escaping from a covered pot and trying to guess how much water is inside and how hot the burner is set. You can make educated inferences, you cannot see directly. There is an analogy I find useful for grasping this, and it comes from medicine. Think of the difference between the symptoms a doctor can observe and the disease processes they cannot directly see. A doctor can measure your temperature, your heart rate, your blood pressure, the visible signs at the surface. From those signs, combined with tests and imaging that probe a little deeper, the doctor builds an inference about what is happening inside, in the organs and tissues that cannot be directly watched. A good doctor can make remarkably accurate inferences this way, but every doctor also knows the humbling truth that the surface signs do not always tell the whole story, that diseases can be silent until they are advanced, that the body can hide its true state for a long time, and that medicine, for all its power, is a practice of probability and inference rather than certainty. Volcanology is exactly like this. The eruptions and tremors and gas emissions are the vital signs. The magma system below is the hidden physiology. The volcanologists are the physicians, reading the signs with great skill and increasingly sophisticated instruments, building careful inferences about a patient they can never fully see inside. And like the best physicians, the best volcanologists hold their conclusions with appropriate humility, always aware of the gap between the signs they can read and the deeper reality those signs only partly reveal. This is why the recharging of the Aira caldera matters so much, and why it deserves to be stated carefully rather than sensationally. We know from those decades of precise ground deformation measurements that magma is accumulating in the system. We can see the floor of the caldera slowly swelling. That is the engine quietly refilling, even as the visible mountain vents its little daily eruptions. And the honest scientific posture toward that fact is a posture of patient, attentive humility. We're not in a position to say when the system will next do something large, because the precursors that would signal such an event have not appeared, and a system can recharge for a very long time, on the order of thousands of years between major events. But we're also not in a position to pretend the loaded system is not there. The smartest framing, the one that respects both the data and your intelligence, is this. We are watching a system that is demonstrably capable of enormous events, that is demonstrably recharging, and that is demonstrably not showing the signs that would precede an enormous event in the near term. All three of those statements are true at the same time, and the discomfort of holding them together is not a flaw in our understanding. It is an accurate reflection of where the science actually stands. And this is the thing I most want you to take away from the whole story, the place where the visible eruption and the invisible system finally meet. The ash falling on Kagoshima on June 7th is the system breathing. It is the mountain doing the small, frequent, survivable thing that it does, the thing the city has built its entire culture of preparedness around. But underneath that, breathing is the reservoir, slowly filling, holding its potential, on a clock that does not run on human time. The eruption is the reminder. The system is the reason. When the people of Kagoshima look up at that wall of ash, the wise ones are not only seeing today's inconvenience and today's hazard, they are being reminded in the most direct way possible of what they live above. The eruption is the planet tapping them on the shoulder just to make sure they have not forgotten. I think it is worth being explicit about why this distinction between the visible eruption and the invisible system is not just an academic nicety, but the single most important idea for thinking clearly about any volcano. The reason people get volcanoes so wrong, the reason they swing between complacency and panic, is that they treat the visible behavior as if it were the whole story. When the volcano is quiet, they assume it is safe, and they build and forget and let their guard down. When it erupts dramatically, they assume the end is near, and they panic. Both reactions are errors, and both spring from the same root mistake of reading the surface as the system. The truth is that the visible behavior and the deep state are loosely coupled in ways that defy simple intuition. A quiet volcano can be dangerously charged. A noisily erupting one can be harmlessly venting. The eruption you see tells you something, but it does not tell you everything, and it certainly does not tell you the future on its own. To think well about a volcano, you have to hold the visible and the invisible as two separate things. To resist the temptation to read tomorrow's catastrophe in today's plume, or today's safety in yesterday's silence, and to defer instead to the patient, instrument-driven inferences of the people whose job is to peer, as best they can, into the hidden depths. This is genuinely hard because it runs against the grain of how our minds want to work, but it is the only path to an accurate relationship with these systems. And it is, I think, exactly the discipline that the best of the scientists and emergency planners around Sakurajima have cultivated. A refusal to be ruled by the drama of the surface, a steady focus on the deeper signals, a calm that comes not from ignoring the danger but from understanding precisely what the danger is and is not. So the most defensible reading of June 7th, the one I would stake my credibility on, is this. This was a notable but characteristic large explosive episode from a volcano that is almost continuously active. It was significant enough to disrupt a major city and warrant an official warning, but it sits well within the established behavioral range of Sakurajima. It is not, on the current evidence, a precursor to anything categorically larger. Its importance comes not from its raw size, which is modest in absolute volcanic terms, but from its location, 4 kilometers from hundreds of thousands of people. An identical eruption in an empty stretch of ocean would be a scientific footnote. This one is a story because of who was standing underneath it. And yet, even as we land on that calm, measured reading, the deeper unease does not fully dissolve, and it should not because the system is real, and the recharging is real, and the someday, however distant, is real. That tension is the price of admission for living near a giant. Now let me turn to the questions that all of this inevitably raises in people's minds, the wilder interpretations, the conspiracies and the omens, because they deserve an honest hearing and an honest answer. Part 8. The Meteor, the Omen, and the Honest Answer. A few days before the June 7th eruption, something else happened in the skies over Sakurajima, and it was the kind of thing that, in an earlier age, would have been read as a sign. A meteor, a bright fireball streaking through the night, was captured on video crossing the sky behind the volcano. The footage is genuinely beautiful. You see the dark silhouette of the mountain, a faint wisp of its constant venting rising from the summit, the deep blue of the night sky behind it, and then, suddenly, a brilliant streak of light cutting downward, a chunk of space rock burning up in the upper atmosphere directly above one of the most famous and active volcanoes on Earth. And then, days later, that same volcano erupts and buries a city in ash. The human mind, confronted with that sequence, does what it has always done. It reaches for a connection. It asks, was the meteor a warning? Did it trigger something? Were the two events linked? I want to take that instinct seriously, because it is a deeply human one, and there is no shame in feeling it, but I also want to give you the honest answer, because honesty is the entire point of what we do here. The meteor and the eruption are not connected. There is no physical mechanism by which a meteor burning up in or passing through the upper atmosphere could trigger or foreshadow a volcanic eruption days later. And the reason comes down to energy, which is the great clarifying lens for cutting through this kind of speculation. A meteor of the sort that produces a bright fireball deposits a relatively tiny amount of energy, most of it high in the atmosphere, tens of kilometers above the surface, where it has no meaningful interaction with the magma plumbing kilometers below the ground. The energy stored in a volcanic system, the heat and pressure of molten rock under enormous confinement, is vastly larger and is entirely governed by processes deep within the Earth. The two phenomena occupy completely different domains. They are not parts of one system. They simply happen to be photographed in the same frame, separated by days, and the coincidence is striking precisely because it is a coincidence. A meteor crosses the sky somewhere on Earth constantly. A volcano erupts somewhere on Earth almost daily. That the two would occasionally line up over the same dramatic mountain is not a mystery. It is statistics. It is the universe occasionally producing a poetic image with no causal story behind it. It is worth understanding why our minds are so powerfully drawn to make these connections, because the impulse is not stupidity. It is one of the most deeply rooted features of human cognition, and recognizing it in ourselves is the first step to thinking clearly. Human beings are pattern-detecting creatures. For the entire span of our evolutionary history, the ability to notice that two things happen together and to infer a connection between them has been one of our most valuable survival tools. The rustle in the grass and the predator that follows, the dark clouds and the storm that comes, the berries that made someone sick and the illness that followed. Spotting these connections kept our ancestors alive, and so we are built deep in our wiring to see patterns, to link events that occur near each other in time, to assume that when one striking thing follows another, the first must somehow have caused the second. This instinct served us magnificently in a world of immediate physical cause and effect, but it misfires badly in a world of independent large-scale systems, where a meteor and a volcano can occupy the same dramatic frame purely by chance. The mind, hungry for a story, supplies one. The meteor must be an omen. The two sky events must be connected. The feeling of connection is powerful precisely because the machinery generating it is ancient and automatic, and the only reliable defense against that misfire is the deliberate learned discipline of asking not whether two things feel connected, but whether there is an actual mechanism that could connect them. Feeling is not evidence. Mechanism is. And in the case of the meteor and the eruption, there is no mechanism, only the coincidence that our pattern-hungry minds have dressed up as meaning. And while we are clearing the air, let me address the broader family of alternative explanations that always rises around events like this, because they are worth confronting directly rather than ignoring. There is a recurring claim, attached to almost every significant geological event, that authorities know more than they are telling, that the true danger is being concealed to prevent panic. In the specific case of Sakurajima, this claim collapses under the weight of the evidence, because the entire local response is built on radical transparency. This is a society that hands out hard hats to children, that builds visible concrete shelters on every corner, that broadcasts ashfall forecasts, that maintains one of the densest public volcano monitoring networks on the planet, and that issued an immediate public ash warning the moment the eruption began. You do not build all of that in plain sight if your strategy is concealment. The openness of the response is itself the refutation of the cover-up. The transparency is the counter-evidence. The energy lens, by the way, is one of the most powerful tools you can carry for evaluating almost any claim about the natural world, and I want to hand it to you explicitly, because it will serve you long after this video ends. Whenever someone proposes that one phenomenon caused or triggered another, the first question to ask is whether the proposed cause carries enough energy, delivered in the right form and the right place, to produce the claimed effect. Nature keeps strict accounts. You cannot get a large effect from a tiny cause unless there is some stored reservoir of energy that the small cause merely releases, like a spark setting off a charge of explosive. So when you hear that a meteor triggered a volcano, you ask, where would the energy come from? And you find that the meteor's energy is minuscule and deposited in the wrong place entirely, high in the atmosphere, with no path to the magma below. When you hear that solar activity triggered an earthquake or eruption, you ask the same question, and you find the same answer, that the energy of the space-weather interaction is vanishingly small compared to the tectonic and volcanic forces involved, and that no mechanism exists to couple the one to the other. The energy accounting almost always settles these questions cleanly, and it does so without requiring you to be an expert in any particular field, only to ask persistently, where is the energy supposed to come from and how is it supposed to get there? Carry that question with you, and you will find that a great many dramatic-sounding claims simply evaporate the moment you apply it. There is also the recurring attempt to link eruptions like this to solar activity, to geomagnetic storms, to space weather, even to human technologies like the high-frequency research facility that endlessly appears in these theories. And here, once again, the clarifying lens of energy does its work. The energy involved in the interaction between solar activity and the Earth's upper atmosphere, while genuinely capable of producing effects like auroras and disturbances in our electrical grids, is many, many orders of magnitude smaller than the energy stored in a volcanic system, and there is no established mechanistically validated pathway by which it could reach down and trigger the ascent of magma. Proposed correlations between space weather and eruptions are statistically weak and physically unmotivated. The honest position is not to mock the question, because asking whether two dramatic natural phenomena are connected is a reasonable thing to wonder, but to answer it with the physics, and the physics says the energy simply is not there to make the connection. I want to be clear that engaging with these alternative ideas is not a waste of time, and I do not bring them up to mock anyone who has wondered about them. Wondering whether a meteor and a volcano are connected, or whether the sun might influence the Earth, or whether authorities are being fully honest. These are reasonable things to wonder, and the impulse behind them, the desire to understand the hidden causes of dramatic events, is the very same impulse that drives science itself. The difference between productive wondering and unproductive conspiracy is not whether you ask the question, but how you go about answering it. The scientific path takes the question seriously, looks for a mechanism, weighs the evidence, calculates the energies, and follows the answer wherever it leads, even when the answer is the boring one, that there is no connection, that it was a coincidence, that the official account is basically correct. The conspiratorial path starts from the assumption of a hidden connection, and then collects whatever seems to support it, while ignoring whatever does not, treating the absence of evidence as proof of a cover-up rather than as evidence of absence. The questions can be identical. It is the method of answering them that separates understanding from delusion. And so, when I dismiss the meteor connection or the solar trigger or the cover-up, I am not dismissing the curiosity that gave rise to them. I am honouring that curiosity by answering it properly, with mechanism and evidence and energy, rather than letting it curdle into a story that feels exciting but is not true. And finally, there is the most dramatic alternative framing of all, the one that takes the genuine fact of the Aira caldera and runs it straight off a cliff into apocalypse. The suggestion that this eruption is the beginning of the end, the first tremor of an imminent caldera-forming super-eruption that will devastate Japan and beyond. I have already given you the careful version of this, but let me restate it as a direct answer to the doomsday framing, because you deserve it. Yes, the Aira caldera is genuinely capable of a catastrophic eruption on geological timescales. Yes, it is recharging. And no, there is no scientific indication whatsoever that such an event is imminent, and an event on that scale would be preceded by enormous, unmistakable warning signs that we are not seeing. The gulf between today's ashfall and a caldera-forming eruption is so vast that treating the one as a sign of the other is like treating a person's ordinary breath as a sign they are about to detonate. The legitimate concern is long-term hazard assessment, the patient work of monitoring a loaded system across centuries. The illegitimate move is to convert that long-term reality into near-term terror. We will not make that move here. We will hold the real concern and reject the false panic, because that is the only honest place to stand. Part 9. The numbers that make it real. I want to slow down now and put some hard numbers in front of you, because so much of how we feel about an event like this depends on getting the scale right, and scale is exactly the thing that sensational coverage tends to blur. So let me anchor you with the figures, and then show you what they actually mean when you stand them next to one another, because the comparisons are where the truth of this story lives. Start with the distance, because it is the number that drives everything. Sakurajima's active summit sits roughly 4 kilometers from central Kagoshima city. 4 kilometers. That is the length of a comfortable morning run. It is a distance you could cover in a car in a few minutes if there were a road straight across the water, and across that water the ferry makes the crossing in about 15 minutes. To have an active, frequently erupting volcano that close to a city of this size is genuinely unusual on the world stage. There are other cities near other volcanoes, but the combination here, the size of the population, the intensity of the volcanic activity, and the smallness of the gap between them, makes Kagoshima one of the most striking examples anywhere of a major urban area in the immediate firing line of a live volcano. Now, the population. Kagoshima City is home to several 100,000 people, a real metropolitan centre with all the infrastructure that implies ports and railways and an airport and dense residential districts. And then there is the smaller, more intimate number, the one that always stops me. Approximately 4,600 people live on Sakurajima itself, on the volcanic island, on the slopes of the mountain that erupts thousands of times a year. Those are not scientists on a temporary rotation. Those are residents. Their homes are there. Their lives are there. They have made the choice, generation after generation, to live on the mountain. It helps to put that 4-kilometer distance into a human frame. because raw numbers slide off the mind until you anchor them to something you can feel. 4 kilometers is a distance most people could walk in under an hour at an easy pace. It is shorter than the commute of a great many people reading this. If you stood on a rooftop in central Kagoshima and looked across the bay, the volcano would not be a distant smudge on the horizon. It would be a dominant feature of your view, close enough to see the texture of its slopes, close enough to watch the ash plume rise in real time, close enough that when it erupts there is no meaningful delay between the event and your experience of it. Compare that to the way most people relate to the hazards in their own lives, which are usually distant, abstract, or invisible. A fault line buried deep underground, a floodplain whose last flood was before anyone living can remember, a distant nuclear plant, a far-off coastline. The hazards most of us live with are easy to forget precisely because we cannot see them. The hazard the people of Kagoshima live with is impossible to forget because it fills their sky. That proximity, that constant visibility, changes the entire psychological texture of the relationship. You cannot pretend a 4-kilometer volcano is not there. It is in your line of sight every single day, and that fact, more than any statistic, is what makes this place such a profound example of human coexistence with raw geological power. Then the eruption figures, with all the honest uncertainty I laid out earlier intact. By the official monitoring account, the principal explosive event on June 7th began at roughly 6:52 in the morning local time and ran until about 7:55, with the ash plume rising on the order of 1,300 meters above the crater. By other accounts, the activity began earlier, around 5 in the morning, and continued in fluctuating pulses for something like 7 hours, with the plume reaching as high as 3,500 meters, around 11,500 feet, with some reports going as high as 4,400 meters. The ash was tracked drifting south, with one advisory placing it roughly 56 kilometers, about 35 miles south of Kagoshima Airport, at an altitude near 3 kilometers, about 10,000 feet. And the direction the ash drifted matters as much as the height it reached, because where the ash goes determines who suffers. On June 7th, the plume drifted toward Kagoshima city and to the south, which is precisely why the city bore the brunt of the fallout and why an ash warning was issued for it specifically. The wind is the wild card in every Sakurajima eruption, the factor that decides, on any given day, which neighborhoods get dusted and which are spared. The residents track it closely, and the ashfall forecasts that are part of the local weather reporting are essentially predictions of where the wind will carry the day's emissions. On a day when the wind blows the ash out over the empty bay or away from the populated areas, an eruption of a given size is a minor event. On a day when the wind carries that same eruption directly over the city, it becomes a major disruption. June 7th was, in this respect, an unlucky day for Kagoshima, with the wind delivering the ash straight into the heart of the urban area. It is a humbling reminder that the impact of a natural event on human beings is not determined by the event alone, but by the chance alignment of the event with the conditions of the moment, the direction of the wind, the time of day, the readiness of the population. The same eruption on a different day, with a different wind, would have left a far smaller mark on human life. And the alert level held at 3 on a 5-point scale, the level that restricts access to the area near the crater, and signals that this is a volcano to be actively reckoned with, not merely observed. Now here is where the comparisons do their work, where the numbers stop being abstract and start telling a story. Take that June 7th eruption, the one that buried a city in ash and made headlines around the world, and set it next to the 1914 Taisho eruption. The 1914 event was the most powerful Japanese eruption of the 20th century, and it produced enough lava to fill an entire strait and weld an island to the mainland. June 7th, for all its drama, did not come remotely close to that. It was a fraction of what the mountain did in 1914. And now take 1914, that 20th century giant, and set it next to the Aira Caldera forming eruption of 30,000 years ago. The Caldera eruption was hundreds of times larger again. Let that ratio sink in. June 7th is dwarfed by 1914. 1914 is dwarfed by the Caldera event. We are looking at a hierarchy of catastrophe with 3 vast steps in it, and the eruption that just put a city on high alert and dominated the news sits on the bottom step, the smallest one, the gentlest one. That is not me minimizing what the people of Kagoshima are going through. The ashfall is real, the disruption is real, the hazard to anyone caught near the crater is real. It is me trying to give you an accurate map of the territory, because the accurate map is more frightening and more reassuring at the same time than any sensational headline could be. More reassuring, because today's event is genuinely small in the mountain's own terms. More frightening, because the mountain's own terms include events so much larger that today's looks like nothing. I want to give you one more comparison to lock this scale into place, because there is a way of measuring volcanic eruptions that makes these relationships precise, and it reveals just how steep the steps in that hierarchy really are. Scientists rank explosive eruptions on a scale of magnitude that works a bit like the scale used for earthquakes, where each step up represents not a small increase, but a roughly tenfold jump in the volume of material erupted. On a scale like that, the routine eruptions of Sakurajima, the daily venting and the moderate explosive events sit very low. A larger event like June 7th climbs a little higher, but still sits in the lower to middle range, the territory of significant but manageable eruptions that disrupt a region without devastating it. The 1914 eruption sits higher still, up in the range of genuinely major eruptions, the kind that occur somewhere in the world only every several years and that can reshape local geography and kill. And a caldera-forming eruption like the Aira event of 30,000 years ago sits near the very top of the scale, in the rarefied and terrible category of the largest eruptions the planet produces, events so infrequent that thousands of years can pass between them anywhere on Earth, events capable of injecting so much material into the atmosphere that they can perturb the global climate for years afterward. When you place June 7th on that scale, you see it for what it is, a real event but a low-ranking one, separated from the caldera-forming catastrophe by several full steps, each step a tenfold leap. The mountain that buried a city in ash and the mountain that could one day darken skies across the hemisphere are the same mountain, the same system, separated only by which step of that staircase it happens to be standing on at any given moment in geological time. Today it stands near the bottom. The staircase, though, goes all the way up. That is the texture of living on the Aira system. The thing that terrifies in the abstract, the caldera, is dormant on any human timescale. The thing that disrupts in the concrete, the daily and occasional eruptions of Sakurajima, is survivable and managed, and the people of Kagoshima live in the space between those two, drawing the line every single day between the hazard they prepare for and the catastrophe they cannot prevent and will almost certainly never see. The numbers are how they, and we, keep that line honest. Part 10. What the instruments are watching for. I have mentioned several times now that Sakurajima is one of the most closely monitored volcanoes on Earth, and I want to take you inside what that monitoring actually is, because it is one of the genuinely hopeful parts of this story, and because understanding it is the best antidote to both careless panic and careless dismissal. When you know what the instruments are listening for, you understand both how much we can see coming and how much we still cannot. The foundation of volcano monitoring is seismology, the study of the ground's vibrations. Beneath and around Sakurajima sits a network of seismometers, instruments sensitive enough to detect the faint tremors that magma produces as it forces its way through cracks in the rock on its journey toward the surface. Magma on the move does not travel silently. It fractures rock, it makes the ground shudder in characteristic patterns, and trained analysts can read those patterns the way a doctor reads a heartbeat, distinguishing the ordinary background rumble from the signatures that mean something is changing. In the hours and minutes before many eruptions, the seismic record shifts, and that shift is one of the most important early warnings we have. Then there is ground deformation, and this is where the monitoring gets almost unbelievably precise. As magma accumulates beneath a volcano, it pushes the ground upward, swelling it like a slow inhalation. The instruments that measure this, tilt meters that sense the faint changes in the slope of the ground, and satellite-based systems that can measure the elevation of the surface from space, are capable of detecting movements of mere centimeters across an entire mountain. This is exactly the technology that revealed the slow recharging of the Aira caldera over the decades. It is also the technology that, in the shorter term, can sometimes catch the swelling that precedes a specific eruption, the ground puffing up as the magma chamber fills and pressurizes before a blast. The alert level system itself deserves a closer look, because it is the crucial bridge between all that raw data and the decisions of ordinary people, and it represents a genuine triumph of turning complex science into actionable clarity. In Japan, volcanoes like Sakurajima are governed by a 5-level alert scale, and each level corresponds not to a vague sense of danger, but to specific recommended actions for specific groups of people. At the lowest levels, the volcano is being watched, but normal life continues. As the level climbs, the restrictions expand outward in concentric rings, first keeping people away from the immediate vicinity of the crater, then from a wider zone, then potentially prompting preparations for the evacuation of inhabited areas, and at the highest levels, evacuation itself. On June 7th, the alert level stood at 3 on that scale, the level that restricts access to the area near the crater, signalling a volcano that is dangerously active and to be kept at a distance, but not one that requires the wholesale evacuation of the city. That single number, 3, is the distilled output of the entire monitoring apparatus, a piece of information compressed and clarified so that a parent deciding whether to send a child to school, or a business deciding whether to open, or a traveller deciding whether to take the ferry, can act on it without needing to interpret seismograms or satellite imagery themselves. It is science translated into a form that ordinary life can use, and the smoothness of that translation, the fact that a complex and uncertain reality can be turned into a clear and trusted number, is one of the quiet achievements that makes coexistence with this mountain possible at all. There is more. Infrasound sensors listen for the low-frequency sound waves below the range of human hearing that explosions produce, allowing analysts to detect and characterize an eruption even when clouds hide the summit. Gas monitoring equipment samples the volcanic emissions because changes in the composition and volume of gases like sulfur dioxide can signal changes in the magma below. And cameras watch the summit around the clock, feeding a constant visual record to the people whose job is to keep the city informed. All of this data flows together to the Japan Meteorological Agency and the local volcanological authorities, who synthesize it into the alert levels and warnings that ordinary residents actually act on. When that ash warning went out on June 7th, it was the output of this entire apparatus, working exactly as designed. All of this data, the seismic, the deformation, the acoustic, the gas, the visual, does not sit in isolated streams. It flows together, in real time, to teams of analysts who integrate it into a single evolving picture of the mountain state. This is the part that is easy to overlook, the human and institutional layer on top of the instruments. The sensors generate data, but data alone is mute. It takes trained experts drawing on decades of accumulated understanding of this specific volcano, and of volcanoes in general, to read those many streams together and form a judgment about what the mountain is doing and what it is likely to do next. It is a bit like the way a skilled physician integrates many separate test results into a single diagnosis, no one number telling the story, but the pattern across all of them revealing the truth. And the institutions that do this work in Japan are among the most experienced and capable in the world, with a deep historical record of Sakurajima's behavior to draw on, a record built up precisely because the mountain erupts so often and has been watched so closely for so long. When an eruption begins, these teams are already watching, already interpreting, already deciding whether the alert level needs to change and whether a warning needs to go out. The ash warning issued on June 7th was not an automatic output of a machine. It was a human judgment, informed by instruments but made by experts, that the conditions warranted telling the city to take the falling ash seriously. That fusion of sophisticated technology and deep human expertise is the real monitoring system, and it is one of the reasons that living beside this particular volcano, in this particular country, is as survivable as it is. But here is the honest limit, and I would be doing you a disservice to leave it out. All of this monitoring is extraordinary, and it has saved lives, and it makes living near Sakurajima far safer than it would otherwise be. And yet it cannot tell us the future with certainty. The instruments are superb at detecting that something is happening and that something is changing. They are far less able to tell us exactly what will happen next and exactly when. A volcano can show all the signs of building toward an eruption and then quietly stand down. It can erupt with relatively little warning. The signals are probabilistic, not deterministic. They shift the odds, they buy time, they enable evacuations and warnings, but they do not hand us a schedule. This is the same humility we encountered with the recharging Caldera, and it is the same humility that runs through all honest engagement with these systems. We can watch the giant breathe. We can measure its swelling chest. We cannot read its mind. And the people of Kagoshima live, knowingly, inside exactly that uncertainty, trusting a monitoring system that is among the best in the world precisely because they understand it is not, and can never be, a crystal ball. That trust, clear-eyed and informed, is itself a kind of quiet heroism, and it brings us back to the human heart of this whole story. Part 11. The volcanoes that erupt together. There is one more layer of context I want to give you before we draw this together, because it speaks directly to a feeling many people have when they watch footage like the June 7th eruption. A creeping sense that the planet has gotten louder lately, that there are suddenly volcanoes erupting everywhere, that something is building. And I want to address that feeling honestly, because it contains a grain of truth wrapped around a misunderstanding, and untangling the two tells you something important about how to read events like this. Here is the truth. At any given moment, there are typically a few dozen volcanoes erupting around the world. Right now, as Sakurajima throws its ash over Kagoshima, there are others, scattered across the planet in various states of activity. There are persistently active volcanoes in the Pacific, in the Andes of South America, in the Indonesian Arc, in the remote north, all of them venting, exploding, glowing, doing their thing, most of them far from any major city, and therefore far from the headlines. This is not new, and it is not a sign of anything. It is the steady-state condition of a geologically alive planet. The Earth is a heat engine, and volcanoes are one of the primary ways it sheds that heat, so there is always a chorus of them going at once. When you happen to notice several eruptions in a short span and feel a chill, what you're usually noticing is not a change in the planet, but a change in your own attention, perhaps prompted by one dramatic event like Sakurajima pulling your focus toward the others that were always there. And here is the misunderstanding I want to gently dismantle. The simultaneous activity of volcanoes around the world is, in the overwhelming majority of cases, not coordinated. These volcanoes are not talking to each other. An eruption in Japan does not trigger an eruption in Indonesia or the Andes. Each volcano is fed by its own local magma system, driven by its own local tectonic setting, on its own local schedule. The fact that several are active at once is the expected behavior of a planet that has hundreds of active volcanoes distributed across it, not evidence of some global awakening or a synchronized build-up toward catastrophe. The pattern your mind wants to see, all these volcanoes going off together, must mean something, is the mind doing what it always does, hunting for connection and agency in what is actually the independent operation of many separate systems. There is one genuinely fascinating exception to the rule of volcanic independence, and I include it because honesty demands the full picture, and because it is a remarkable phenomenon in its own right. On rare occasions, a truly enormous eruption can have global effects, not by triggering other volcanoes, but by altering the climate of the entire planet. When an eruption is large enough to inject vast quantities of gas and fine particles high into the stratosphere, above the weather, those particles can spread around the globe and reflect a portion of incoming sunlight back into space, cooling the planet's surface for a year or more. History records several such events, where a single colossal eruption somewhere in the world produced cold summers, failed harvests, and hardship on the far side of the planet. There is a famous case from the early 19th century, a year remembered as the year without a summer, when an eruption in Indonesia chilled the climate across the northern hemisphere, causing crop failures and famine thousands of kilometers from the volcano. So volcanoes can, in this specific and dramatic way, reach across the entire planet and touch lives everywhere. But notice what this exception actually is. It is not one volcano triggering another. It is one sufficiently gigantic eruption affecting the global climate through the atmosphere, and the eruptions capable of this are the rarest and largest of all, the Caldera-forming monsters and their near relatives, the events at the very top of that magnitude staircase. June 7th at Sakurajima comes nowhere close to this category. The only Sakurajima-related event that could conceivably reach such global scale would be a full Caldera-forming eruption of the Aira system. The very catastrophe we have established is not on any near-term horizon. So the exception, real as it is, only sharpens the main point. Ordinary eruptions are local and independent. Only the rarest giants go global, and they do it through the sky, not through the rock. The honest reading is that simultaneous global volcanic activity is the baseline state, not an anomaly, and not a coordinated phenomenon. There is also a psychological dimension to this worth naming, because it explains why the feeling of a global volcanic awakening can be so persistent even when the data does not support it. We live in an age of unprecedented access to information, where an eruption in the remotest corner of the planet can be filmed on a phone and shared around the world within minutes. A century ago, an eruption in a distant land might never have reached your awareness at all, or might have arrived weeks later as a brief item in a newspaper. Today, every significant eruption, and many insignificant ones, lands in front of your eyes, often within hours, accompanied by dramatic footage. So when you perceive that there are suddenly volcanoes erupting everywhere, what has actually changed is not the planet's behavior but your window onto it. The eruptions were always happening, you simply could not see them before. This is one of the great cognitive distortions of the modern information environment. The way it can make a constant background rate of events feel like a rising tide, simply because we are now connected to all of it at once. The honest correction is to remember that the steady drumbeat of global volcanic activity is the normal condition of the Earth, that it has always been this loud, and that your sudden awareness of it reflects the reach of the camera and the network, not a change in the mountains themselves. Now there is a subtler and more legitimate version of the connection idea, and intellectual honesty requires me to acknowledge it. Volcanoes that sit on the same tectonic structure, fed by the same subduction zone, are responding to the same deep driver, and in that limited sense they are related. The volcanoes of the Japanese arc, Sakurajima among them, are all expressions of the same subduction process I described earlier, all fed by the water sweated out of the same descending plates. So if you ask whether Sakurajima is connected to the other volcanoes of Japan, the answer is yes, in the sense that they share a common geological engine. But that is very different from saying that one eruption causes or signals another, or that the planet as a whole is entering some special phase. The connection is structural and ancient, not a sudden conspiracy of mountains, and keeping that distinction sharp is exactly the kind of careful thinking that separates understanding from alarm. The same subduction engine that built and feeds Sakurajima is the reason Japan has so many volcanoes and so many great earthquakes, and that engine has been running for millions of years and will run for millions more. June 7th is one beat of that ancient rhythm, not the first note of a new and frightening song. Part 12. Living Knowingly on a Loaded Planet. Let me bring us back now, from the instruments and the tectonics and the global chorus of volcanoes, to the thing that has been the beating heart of this story all along, a city, a mountain, 4 kilometers of water between them, and a people who have chosen to make that work. When you sit with this story long enough, it stops being about geology and starts being about something closer to philosophy, a question about how to live well in the presence of a danger you cannot remove. Most of us spend a great deal of energy trying to arrange our lives so that danger is out of sight and out of mind, and we mistake that arrangement for safety. The people of Kagoshima do not have that option, and in losing it they have gained something the rest of us often lack, a direct and unflinching relationship with the genuine conditions of existence on this planet. They cannot pretend the danger away, so they have learned to live with it honestly instead, and the honesty turns out to be a kind of strength. I find myself returning, again and again, to the image of the schoolchildren in their helmets, because it compresses the entire story into a single picture. Think about what that image actually represents. It is not the image of a community in denial, pretending the danger is not there. You do not put a helmet on a child to deny a danger. It is also not the image of a community paralyzed by fear, fleeing or huddling or unable to function. Helmeted children are walking to school, going about the ordinary business of being children, in the presence of a real and acknowledged hazard. The helmet is the precise physical embodiment of the whole philosophy I have been describing, the philosophy of clear-eyed coexistence. It says, we know the mountain throws rock. We have measured how dangerous that is. We have responded proportionately, and now we are going to go live our lives fully and normally in its shadow. That is not a failure to take the danger seriously. It is the most serious possible response to it, the response that neither underreacts nor overreacts, but matches the actual risk with the actual mitigation, and then refuses to let the risk steal the life that has to be lived around it. There is a concept that captures this beautifully, and it comes from the study of how societies relate to risk over long spans of time. Researchers who study disasters have noticed that human communities have a tendency to normalize the threats they live with, to let the memory of catastrophe fade as the years of safety accumulate, so that the danger comes to feel abstract and unreal, and preparedness erodes until the catastrophe returns and finds everyone unready. It is a deeply human failing, this slow forgetting, and it is the reason so many disasters seem, in hindsight, to have been foreseeable yet unprepared for. What is remarkable about Kagoshima is that it has, to an unusual degree, resisted this forgetting. The mountain will not let them forget. It vents and rumbles and dusts the city often enough that the danger can never quite recede into abstraction. The ash on the windshield every few weeks is a tactile, unavoidable reminder that the threat is real and present, and now. In a strange way, the constant low-level activity of Sakurajima is a kind of gift, because it keeps the community's memory fresh, and its preparedness sharp in a way that a volcano which erupted only once a century never could. A volcano that erupts rarely lulls the people around it into forgetting. A volcano that erupts constantly keeps them honest. The people of Kagoshima are perhaps so good at living with their mountain precisely because their mountain never gives them the chance to pretend it is not there. I think there is a lesson in that which reaches far beyond one Japanese city, and I want to offer it to you plainly, because it is the reason this story has stayed with me. All of us, everywhere, live on a loaded planet. Most of us simply have the luxury of not being able to see the loading. We live near faults we never think about, on coastlines that have flooded before and will flood again, downstream of dams, downwind of industry, on a thin crust floating over a vast reservoir of molten rock. The difference between the people of Kagoshima and the rest of us is not that they face danger, and we do not. The difference is that their danger is visible, smoking on the horizon, 4 kilometers away, impossible to ignore. And because they cannot ignore it, they have been forced to develop something the rest of us often lack: a mature, practical, unhysterical relationship with the genuine hazards of being alive on this particular world. They have figured out how to hold the knowledge of catastrophe without being crushed by it, and how to prepare for the worst without surrendering the present to dread. That is a skill. It is, arguably, one of the most important skills a person or a society can have, and the people of Kagoshima have it because their mountain has insisted that they develop it. I want to be careful here not to romanticize what is, for the people living through it, often simply a hardship. It is easy, from the outside, to turn the coexistence of Kagoshima and its volcano into a tidy parable about human resilience, and there is truth in that parable, but there is also a daily grind that the parable can obscure. The ash is genuinely unpleasant to live with. It gets into everything. It damages cars and roofs and gardens. It triggers respiratory problems. It costs money, constantly, in cleaning and repairs and lost time. The eruptions are sometimes frightening, and the larger ones, like June 7th, disrupt lives in real and costly ways, grounding flights, stopping trains, keeping children inside, coating a city in grit. For the 4,600 people on the island, there is always the underlying knowledge that they may someday have to abandon their homes at short notice. This is not a romantic adventure. It is a difficult, ongoing negotiation with a hazardous neighbour, sustained through real effort and real sacrifice. And I think respecting that difficulty is part of telling the story honestly. The people of Kagoshima are not living a charming life beside a picturesque volcano. They are doing hard, practical, unglamorous work every day to remain safe and functional in a place that nature has made genuinely dangerous. The admiration I feel for them is not admiration for a postcard. It is admiration for a community that has faced a real and permanent threat with clarity, competence, and a refusal to be either reckless or paralysed, and that has paid, and continues to pay, the ongoing price that such a life demands. So when I look at the footage of that black wall of ash standing over the apartment towers, I no longer just see a disaster. I see a relationship. I see a city and a volcano that have been negotiating with each other for over a century, since the mountain reached out and joined itself to the land in 1914, and that will go on negotiating long after this particular eruption has been swept off the streets and forgotten by the wider world. The June 7th eruption is one moment in that long negotiation. The ash will be cleared. The alert level will eventually ease. The ferries will keep running their 15-minute crossings. The children will keep wearing their helmets. And the mountain will keep breathing day after day, exactly as it has for longer than any of us have been alive. That continuity, that ongoing, managed, knowing coexistence is the real story here. Far more than any single plume of ash, however dramatic. And it leaves us with one final question, the deepest one, the one the scientists and the residents both carry quietly beneath everything else. Part 13. What the system is building toward. We have travelled a long way from that first image of the black wall over the city, and I want to end by returning to the question that has been waiting underneath this entire story. the core mystery that no amount of monitoring or preparedness can fully resolve. What is the Aira system building toward, and will anyone alive ever see it? Let me lay out the genuine tension one last time, because it is the most honest thing I can leave you with. On one side, we have the certainty. The Aira Caldera produced a catastrophe 30,000 years ago that helped shape the entire region, a caldera-forming eruption hundreds of times larger than the most powerful Japanese eruption of the last century. And the system that produced it is not dead. It is recharging. We can measure the magma slowly accumulating, the caldera floor slowly swelling, the reservoir slowly refilling across the decades. That much is settled science. The giant is not gone. The giant is feeding. On the other side, we have the uncertainty, and it is total. We do not know when the system will next do something on that scale. We have no precursors suggesting it is near. A caldera system can recharge for thousands upon thousands of years between major events, and when one finally comes, it would be expected to announce itself with months or years of escalating, unmistakable warning signs that the world's densest volcano monitoring networks would catch and broadcast. So the most likely answer to whether anyone alive will see the next caldera-forming eruption of Aira is no, almost certainly not. Not us, not our children, not our distant descendants for a very long time to come. The someday is real, and the someday is, in all probability, unimaginably far away. There is a way of thinking about deep time that I find helps make sense of this, and it involves shrinking the unimaginable down to a scale a human mind can hold. Imagine compressing the 30,000 years since the Aira caldera formed into a single year. On that compressed calendar, the caldera-forming eruption happens on the 1st of January, and everything since, the entire history of the region, the growth of Sakurajima as a post-caldera cone, the arrival of human civilization in the area, the rise of the city of Kagoshima, all of it unfolds across the months that follow. The 1914 eruption, that 20th century giant that built the land bridge, would fall in the very last hours of December the 31st, a moment ago on this scale, and the June 7th eruption we have been discussing would be the final second before midnight. On the compressed calendar of the Aira system, all of recorded human experience of this volcano, every eruption anyone has ever witnessed or documented, occupies only the last fraction of the final day. The caldera-forming event that looms over the whole story sits a full year in the past, and the question of when the next one might come is a question about some indefinite future point that, on this scale, could be many compressed years away. This is the timescale the Earth operates on, and it is almost impossible for creatures like us, who live for a few decades and remember a few centuries, to truly internalize. But internalizing it is the key to holding the Aira system correctly in mind. The threat is real on the planet's timescale and almost unimaginably distant on ours, and both of those truths have to be held at once, the way the people of Kagoshima hold them, going about their lives in the final second before a midnight that may not arrive for a very long time, if it arrives in any span we would recognize at all. And yet I cannot quite let you leave with only the reassurance, because the reassurance, while true, is not the whole truth. The whole truth includes the fact that the Earth does not consult our preferences or our timescales. The whole truth is that the same monitoring humility that tells us we would probably see a caldera eruption coming also tells us that the deep behavior of these systems holds genuine surprises, that our models are good but not perfect, that the gap between what we can measure at the surface and what is truly happening kilometers below remains real. The honest scientist does not say it cannot happen in our lifetimes. The honest scientist says it is extremely unlikely, that there is no sign of it, and that we are watching closely, which is a very different and more truthful thing than a flat promise of safety. We live, all of us, in the space between extremely unlikely and impossible, and that space, however thin, is where the genuine mystery lives. And maybe that is the truest way to understand what we watched on June 7th, and what the people of Kagoshima watch all the time. We are used to thinking of the ground as the very definition of stability, the thing we mean when we say solid ground, the fixed and reliable foundation beneath everything else in our lives. But that stability is a local illusion, a feature of the short human timescale on which we happen to live. Stretch your view out far enough, and the ground becomes something else entirely, a thin and restless skin over a churning interior, a surface that flows and cracks and rises and falls, and occasionally tears open to let the heat of the planet's heart escape. The people of Kagoshima have had that illusion of solid ground stripped away from them by their mountain. They live with the knowledge, made unavoidable by the smoking peak across the bay, that the ground is not a fixed foundation but a living process, that the earth beneath them is not finished and never will be, that they are perched on the surface of a world that is still, after 4.5 billion years, intensely, violently alive. Most of us are protected from that knowledge by the quietness of the ground beneath our own feet. The people of Kagoshima are not protected from it. They look it in the face every day, and rather than being destroyed by that confrontation with the planet's raw power, they have built lives of remarkable normalcy and dignity in its presence. There is something almost heroic in that, in the ordinary courage of raising a family and running a shop and sending children to school in helmets, 4 kilometers from a mountain that has never fully stopped erupting, on the rim of a caldera that once helped erase the world around it. It is, in the end, what all of us do, whether we know it or not. We live our lives on a violent planet and we make our peace with that the best we can. The people of Kagoshima just do it with their eyes open and with the giant in plain view. So here is where I will leave you. The ash that fell on Kagoshima on June 7th is the system breathing. It is the small, frequent, survivable thing that a living volcano does. The thing the city has built an entire civilization of preparedness around. The thing that will be swept up and moved past within days. But underneath that breath is the reservoir, filling in the dark, on a clock that does not run on human time, holding a potential that dwarfs everything the mountain has done in all of recorded history. The people of Kagoshima have made their peace with that contradiction. They have chosen to live, fully and well, 4 kilometers from a giant that is, in the slowest and most patient way imaginable, waking up. Not soon. Probably not for a span of time longer than human civilization has existed, but waking all the same. And the deepest truth of this story, the one that lingers long after the ashes cleared, is that the eruption we watch today is not the event. It is the reminder. The event is still out there, somewhere in the deep future, and the only honest thing any of us can say about it is that the system itself will tell us when it is ready, through its precursors, long before it acts. Until then, the city watches the mountain, and the mountain watches the city, and the bay between them holds its ancient patient scar, waiting, as it has waited for 30,000 years, for a someday that may never come in any time we will ever know. The watching continues. It always has, and on a planet like this one, it always will.